Did you know that one of Christianity's founding apostles was born in Africa and evangelized across the continent? How did this African apostle change the course of history? What if I told you that the spiritual heart of Africa was instrumental in shaping Christianity, long before it became a European religion? What truths about Africa's role in Christianity have been hidden from history? In the heart of North Africa, where the Mediterranean breeze meets the sands of time, a young man was born whose influence would shape the very foundations of Christianity. St. Mark's journey brought him to Egypt, where he would plant the first Christian seeds in the fertile land of Alexandria. As Christianity spread across Africa, the clash between the old African spiritual traditions and the new faith was inevitable. But in sacred areas untouched by foreign hands, the indigenous practices held firm. Christianity, influenced by African traditions, reshaped not only the spiritual but also the social fabric of these communities, giving rise to a new way of life rooted in unity, compassion, and justice. Today, St. Mark's legacy lives on, not only in Egypt but across the African continent, where his story is a testament to the power of African Christianity and its deep roots in the continent's spiritual soil. In the ancient world, Africa was a vibrant crossroads of culture, religion, and philosophy. From the pyramids of Egypt to the philosophers of Carthage, Africa has long been a center of human civilization. Among the many influential figures to emerge from this rich soil was St. Mark, the African-born apostle, whose legacy would shape the very fabric of Christianity. Born in Cyrene, an ancient Greek city located in present-day Libya, Mark's journey to become one of the key figures in the spread of Christianity was marked by his African heritage, an identity that would influence his interpretation and dissemination of the Christian message. Cyrene was more than just a geographical location. It was a melting pot of cultures. Greek, Roman, and Egyptian influences intermingled, giving birth to a distinctive African identity. It was in this dynamic environment that Mark was raised. Historical records suggest that Mark's family were Jewish, which allowed him to connect with both Jewish and Gentile audiences as he began his evangelical mission. Cyrene was a significant city in the Roman Empire, known for its intellectual and religious diversity. This blend of cultures and beliefs exposed Mark to a range of ideas, from Greek philosophy to Egyptian spirituality, all of which would shape his approach to the Christian faith. The early years of Mark's life were likely filled with exposure to different worldviews. However, it was his conversion to Christianity and subsequent travels that would ultimately define his legacy. Mark's connection to St. Peter, the rock upon which Christ built his church, set the stage for his future as a missionary and evangelist. It was Peter who is believed to have sent Mark to Egypt, where he would begin his groundbreaking work of spreading the teachings of Christ. But what made Mark's evangelistic work unique was his understanding of African spirituality. Mark did not simply transplant foreign religious ideals into Africa. Instead, he sought to communicate the Christian message in a way that resonated with African minds and hearts. African spirituality, deeply rooted in the reverence of ancestors, nature, and the divine, was a powerful force in the ancient world. Rather than replace this worldview, Mark sought to find common ground, introducing Christ as a divine being who was not foreign but familiar in the African understanding of the spiritual realm. This was crucial in Egypt, where Mark's message of salvation was received with open arms. Christianity was not seen as a mere import from the West, but as a message of spiritual renewal that aligned with Africa's long-standing traditions of reverence for the divine. His approach laid the foundation for the Coptic Church, which would go on to become one of Africa's most influential Christian institutions. The Copts, who are descendants of Egypt's ancient Christian community, regard Saint Mark as their spiritual founder and a symbol of Africa's deep-rooted connection to Christianity. Saint Mark's African perspective on Christianity transcended his geographical origins. His ability to bridge African spirituality with Christian doctrine marked a turning point in the spread of Christianity across the continent. Today, African Christians look to Mark not just as an apostle, but as an embodiment of the African perspective on Christianity, one that integrates ancient spiritual traditions with the teachings of Christ. For them, Mark is a reminder that Africa was never a passive recipient of foreign religion, but an active participant in shaping the course of Christian history. Mark's African roots served not just as a point of origin, but as a spiritual wellspring, enabling him to evangelize in a way that was both respectful and transformative. His mission was not only to spread the gospel, but to make Christianity relevant to the African soul, a feat he accomplished by drawing from the spiritual richness of Africa. Today, Saint Mark is not just an apostle in Christian tradition. He is a symbol of Africa's central role in the early history of Christianity.
The sacred deserts and cultural riches of North Africa.
Saint Mark's journey from Cyrene to Egypt was not merely a physical relocation. It marked the beginning of a profound transformation in the spiritual landscape of Africa. Arriving in Alexandria around 42 AD, Mark was not only stepping onto the soil of Egypt, but also into a world at the crossroads of African, Greek, and Roman influences. Alexandria, renowned as one of the most significant intellectual centers of the ancient world, was the perfect location for the spread of Christianity. The city was already a hub for scholarly thought, attracting philosophers, astronomers, and writers. However, it was also a place where pagan rituals and polytheism dominated religious life. When Mark began his mission in Alexandria, he was faced with the challenge of introducing Christianity in a region that was steeped in centuries-old spiritual practices. Egypt was home to a rich religious history, from the ancient worship of the gods of the Nile to the philosophical schools influenced by Plato and Aristotle. For Mark, the task of evangelizing wasn't simply about introducing a new religion, but rather about showing how the message of Christ connected with the existing spiritual framework. African spirituality, with its emphasis on the divine's presence in everyday life, its understanding of ancestral connections, and the sacredness of nature, was not so foreign to Mark. He recognized that Christ's message was not something that should be forced upon the people of Africa, but something that should resonate with their existing belief in the divine, in community, and in morality. Mark's first converts were largely Egyptians and Jews, who found in the teachings of Christ a profound connection to their own understanding of justice, divine order, and salvation. He started preaching in the synagogues of Alexandria, appealing to the Jewish population who were waiting for the promised Messiah. However, his message soon spread beyond Jewish circles, as Gentile Egyptians and even Romans began to embrace his message. Mark's evangelical style was one of inclusivity, recognizing that Africa's spiritual traditions were not to be erased, but rather to be transformed by the light of Christianity. As Mark's influence grew, so did his challenges. Alexandria, though a melting pot of cultures, was also a place of spiritual conflict. The existing pagan religions, as well as the intellectual and philosophical movements, were deeply ingrained in the culture. Mark's efforts met with resistance from both religious leaders and political authorities. Despite the growing number of converts, he faced harsh persecution, culminating in his eventual martyrdom. However, it is through his suffering and unyielding commitment to the Christian cause that Mark's legacy was solidified. His martyrdom in 68 AD is seen not just as the end of his earthly mission but as the final testament to the strength and power of his faith. Despite the trials Mark faced, his evangelical work laid the foundations for what would become the Coptic Church, one of the oldest Christian communities in Africa. The Copts trace their origins directly to Saint Mark, and they honor him as their founder. His missionary work in Egypt continued to reverberate throughout Africa, influencing the development of Christianity across the continent. From Alexandria, Christianity spread to Ethiopia, Nubia, and further into the heart of Africa, as Mark's teachings became a bridge between Africa's spiritual past and the Christian faith. His influence can still be seen in the traditions of African Christianity, which often retain elements of African spirituality and incorporate them into Christian practice. Mark's impact wasn't limited to Egypt alone. As he preached along the Nile, he also made his way south into Nubia and Ethiopia, where his teachings took root in the regions we now know as modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world, regards Saint Mark as a founding figure. In Ethiopia, where Christianity flourished from the early centuries of the Common Era, Mark's influence is still felt today. His legacy is entrenched in the spiritual and cultural fabric of Africa, a living testament to his unyielding dedication to spreading the word of Christ across the continent. Moreover, Mark's journey was not just physical, but also symbolic of Africa's role in the Christian narrative. He took the Christian faith beyond the borders of Europe, preaching a message that was deeply intertwined with Africa's spiritual identity. Africa's sacred lands, with their ancient traditions and spiritual wisdom, served as the fertile ground for Christianity to take root. The sacredness of these lands was respected by Mark and his followers, and this deep respect for African spirituality created a harmonious relationship between the Christian faith and the indigenous beliefs of the region. Saint Mark's mission is a reminder that Christianity in Africa didn't begin with colonization or European missionaries. It began with African evangelists, grounded in African spirituality, and shaped by the unique needs and beliefs of the African people. Through Saint Mark's eyes, the gospel was not a foreign imposition but a message of liberation, redemption, and spiritual unity. Today, his mission remains a beacon of hope, guiding millions of African Christians in their faith and reaffirming the African roots of Christianity. The legacy of Saint Mark is an African story, one of faith, perseverance, and spiritual resilience. The story of Saint Mark's evangelistic journey cannot be separated from the spiritual landscape of ancient Africa, particularly the sacred lands that defined African belief systems. Long before Christianity arrived, Africa was home to deeply rooted spiritual practices, many of which revolved around reverence for nature, ancestors, and a pantheon of divine forces. African spirituality was not just a religion but a comprehensive worldview that governed every aspect of life, from community structures to individual actions. Mark's mission was thus inherently complex, as he sought to introduce a new faith to people whose spiritual lives were intricately intertwined with centuries-old beliefs. At the heart of African spirituality was the belief in a supreme being, along with spirits of nature and ancestors who played a significant role in guiding and protecting individuals and communities. In regions like Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia, the reverence for the divine and the sacred was not limited to temples or shrines, but was a lived experience, woven into daily rituals, festivals, and social interactions. Many Africans believed in the immanence of the divine, meaning that God or the gods were ever present, not just in sacred spaces but throughout the natural world. The gods of the Nile, for example, were worshipped in rivers, mountains, and forests. For St. Mark, this posed a challenge. How could he present a new faith in a way that resonated with a deeply entrenched worldview that revered these forces as divine? The clash between African spirituality and Christian doctrine wasn't just philosophical, it was also social. As Mark began spreading the message of Christ, he faced significant resistance from the powerful priests of Egypt and other traditional religious leaders, who saw the Christian movement as a threat to their authority and influence. Christianity, with its monotheistic foundation, directly contradicted the polytheistic and ancestor-worshipping traditions of Africa. Many Africans, particularly in the early stages of evangelism, struggled to reconcile their spiritual beliefs with the new Christian faith that Mark was preaching. The idea of a single, invisible God, who was not present in nature but existed outside of it, was an unfamiliar and difficult concept for those who had been raised to see the divine in everything around them.
Yet, St. Mark did not force Christianity upon the African people. Rather, he employed a contextual approach, one that acknowledged the richness of African spirituality while introducing the gospel. Mark found common ground between Christian teachings and African values such as community, moral righteousness, and the reverence of the divine. His message focused on the idea of God's presence in all things, a concept that resonated deeply with African beliefs. He taught that Jesus Christ was not a foreign God but rather the fulfillment of humanity's deepest spiritual longings, a divine figure who embodied the values of justice, peace, and universal love. In Egypt, the resistance to Christianity became more intense as Mark's influence spread. The pagan priests, who maintained control over the temples and sacred sites, viewed Christianity as a direct challenge to their authority. Their religious rituals, which often involved the worship of gods like Ra, Isis, and Osiris, were central to the fabric of Egyptian society. Mark's Christian message, with its rejection of idols and the belief in the one true God, represented an existential threat to the existing social order. In some cases, Mark and his followers faced open persecution, and the new Christian faith was branded as heretical by local religious authorities. Moreover, one of the most significant challenges Mark faced was the cultural divide between the Roman and African ways of life. While Rome sought to impose its own forms of governance, religion, and philosophy, Africa's ancient traditions held a deep respect for local customs, tribal structures, and spiritual autonomy. The belief in sacred spaces, where foreigners were forbidden to step, further complicated Mark's mission. Many Africans, particularly in regions like Egypt and Nubia, saw their sacred sites. Whether they were temples, burial grounds, or ancestral shrines, as off-limits to outsiders. These sacred areas were not only physical locations but also symbolic representations of a people's identity and connection to their ancestors. For Mark to gain access to these sacred spaces and win the trust of African communities, he had to respect and acknowledge the importance of these places in the spiritual and social lives of the people. At the same time, Mark's approach to African sacred lands proved to be a double-edged sword. While he respected the sacredness of African spirituality, he also recognized that Christianity would need to build its own spiritual spaces, churches, altars, and rituals, to provide African believers with a sense of belonging. In this way, Mark laid the foundations for a new form of African Christianity, one that didn't merely imitate European practices but reflected the spiritual essence of the African continent. As Christian communities grew in Egypt, and later in Ethiopia and Nubia, the Christian faith became deeply intertwined with the African landscape, offering an alternative that was both spiritually fulfilling and culturally relevant. Despite the many challenges Mark faced, his work was transformative. Through his missionary efforts, he not only spread Christianity but also introduced a new way for Africans to engage with the divine. One that was deeply connected to their spiritual practices and traditions, while also offering a new path toward salvation. Christianity, as Mark presented it, was not an invasion of foreign beliefs but a means to enrich Africa's spiritual heritage. Through his understanding of the African worldview, Mark successfully planted seeds of Christianity in the sacred soil of Africa, ensuring that it would grow and flourish for centuries to come. Today, the Coptic Church and many other African Christian communities still hold Saint Mark in reverence as the founder of African Christianity, a man who bridged the gap between two worlds and introduced a faith that honored both the sacred lands of Africa and the message of Christ. As Saint Mark's teachings spread across Egypt and further into Africa, the emergence of Christian communities brought about profound social transformations. Christianity did not only alter the spiritual identity of Africans but also reshaped the way they organized society, interacted with one another, and engaged with the world. Unlike many foreign religions that demanded Africans abandon their traditions, Mark's African-rooted evangelism allowed for the blending of Christian teachings with core African values. The result was a unique African Christianity that elevated the dignity of individuals, strengthened community bonds, and introduced new systems of justice and charity. One of the most striking social benefits was the rise of communal solidarity. African society had always been deeply communal, with strong emphasis on kinship, family, and collective responsibility. Mark's message of the early Christian church, described in the Acts of the Apostles as one where believers shared all things in common, resonated perfectly with African traditions of communal living. In Alexandria and beyond, Christian gatherings became spaces of mutual support, where the poor were cared for, the sick were healed, and the oppressed found refuge. This mirrored Africa's sacred duty of protecting the vulnerable within the community, reinforcing the sense that Christianity was not foreign but deeply aligned with African social ethics. Moreover, Mark's Christian communities championed education and knowledge, which became cornerstones of African Christian society. Alexandria, already a global center of learning, became home to the Catechetical School of Alexandria, founded by the early church and attributed in spirit to Mark's vision. This school became the world's first Christian theological institution, producing great thinkers like Clement of Alexandria and Origen. The blending of African spirituality with Christian theology created intellectual traditions that not only shaped African Christianity but also influenced global Christian thought. It was within these African Christian schools that concepts of monasticism and ascetic living took shape, later spreading to Europe and Asia. Thus, an African innovation birthed one of Christianity's most enduring spiritual traditions. The respect for sacred areas also had a profound social effect. In many African communities, certain lands, shrines, and groves were forbidden to foreigners, serving as sanctuaries where spiritual and cultural identity was preserved. Mark's acknowledgement of this principle safeguarded Christian converts from being perceived as betrayers of their culture. Instead, the new Christian faith built its own sacred spaces, churches and monasteries, while still respecting the untouchable shrines of old. This allowed Christianity to grow alongside African traditions rather than in opposition to them. The social benefit was clear. It reduced hostility between Christian converts and traditionalists, fostering a fragile but real coexistence. Over time, many sacred spaces themselves became Christianized, blending African reverence for holy grounds with Christian liturgy. Christianity also became a force of justice and equality within African communities. In a world dominated by rigid hierarchies, whether Roman political authority or priestly power in traditional religions, Christianity offered a radical message that all were equal before God. This appealed especially to the marginalized, women, slaves, and the poor. In Mark's communities, women found greater participation in spiritual life, while slaves and commoners were treated as brothers and sisters in faith. This social leveling was revolutionary in an age of inequality, and it reflected Africa's long-standing moral codes that emphasized fairness, truth, and balance, values already central in Egyptian spirituality through the concept of Ma'at. Perhaps the greatest social legacy of St. Mark's African mission was the birth of the Coptic Orthodox Church, which continues to be a vital part of Africa's cultural and spiritual identity. The Coptic Church became more than a place of worship. It was a community center, a court of justice, a school of learning, and a guardian of tradition. It became a shield against Roman persecution and, later, against cultural erasure. In time, the influence of this African-rooted Christianity reached beyond Egypt, shaping Ethiopia, Nubia, and other regions of Africa. Through Mark's vision, Christianity in Africa was not just a religion, it was a social revolution. It upheld the sacredness of community, protected African spiritual identity, and introduced systems of charity, education, and justice that continue to benefit societies today. St. Mark's legacy was not merely the founding of a church but the creation of a new way of life that carried the African soul into the heart of Christianity. His mission proved that faith could both transform and be transformed by Africa, leaving a legacy of resilience and progress that echoes across the continent even now. The story of St. Mark did not end with his martyrdom in Alexandria. It blossomed into a legacy that continues to shape Africa and the Christian world at large. Today, millions of African Christians see Mark not only as the founder of the Coptic Orthodox Church but also as the embodiment of Africa's voice in Christianity. His life demonstrates that Christianity was not a foreign religion brought by colonial powers, but a faith that was born, nurtured, and rooted in African soil more than 2,000 years ago. This truth redefines the African Christian identity, reminding believers that their ancestors were among the earliest custodians of the gospel. The influence of St. Mark can still be seen in the enduring strength of the Coptic Church in Egypt and the Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox traditions, which trace their roots to the seeds he planted. These churches, among the oldest in the world, stand as a living witness to Africa's pioneering role in global Christianity. Their survival, despite centuries of persecution, invasions, and political upheavals, is proof of the resilience of African faith. They serve as a bridge between ancient traditions and modern Christianity, preserving the African interpretation of Christ's message, one that emphasizes community, justice, and sacred respect for the divine. What makes St. Mark's legacy particularly powerful is how it harmonized with African sacred traditions. The respect for holy lands, the sanctity of community, and the balance of justice, principles deeply ingrained in African spirituality, were not destroyed by Christianity but strengthened through it. By acknowledging these sacred boundaries, Christianity in Africa grew organically, finding a place within the cultural and spiritual framework of the continent. This created a version of Christianity that was not alien but authentically African, demonstrating that the gospel could be adapted without losing its essence. In today's Africa, St. Mark's legacy is reflected in the explosive growth of Christianity, now home to some of the world's fastest-growing Christian populations. African churches are not merely surviving, they are shaping global Christianity through music, theology, missions, and social justice. The African Church has become a source of spiritual renewal for Christians worldwide, drawing strength from the foundations laid by early apostles like Mark. His vision of a faith rooted in community and spirituality resonates deeply with Africans today, who continue to see Christianity as both a divine inheritance and a force for social transformation.
Ultimately, St. Mark stands as a symbol of Africa's enduring contribution to the Christian story. His birth in Cyrene, his mission in Egypt, his respect for sacred African traditions, and his martyrdom in Alexandria form a narrative that transcends time. African Christians honor him as a saint, but more importantly, as proof that Africa was not on the sidelines of Christianity. It was at its very heart. In every sacred hymn sung in a Coptic church, in every Ethiopian liturgy, and in every African Christian gathering, the voice of St. Mark echoes. Christianity is as African as it is global. His legacy is not only one of faith but of cultural pride, resilience, and the unshakable truth that Africa helped shape the world's greatest religion. From the sands of Cyrene to the sacred temples of Alexandria, St. Mark's footsteps still echo across Africa. He was not just an apostle, he was Africa's voice in Christianity, a bridge between ancient spirituality and the gospel. His legacy proves that Africa did not receive Christianity passively. It helped shape it at its very core. Even today, the African Church stands tall, rooted in Mark's vision of justice, community, and sacred truth. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more untold truths of Africa's powerful history.